10 years ago, I was in the Army, stationed at Fort Benning in Georgia. In Georgia, there can be a load of completely random thunderstorms in the summer. They really do just come out of nowhere. The sky can be blue and sunny with barely a single cloud in the sky, and then 20 minutes later, you would think you're in the worst storm of your life. When these storms approach, the base would issue lightning warnings. They would blow their air sirens, and all personnel on the base were supposed to get inside for safety. We were out in the field doing some pre-deployment tasks, and were heading in to get cover. As we were in the middle of doing that, a soldier about 50 meters away all of a sudden got struck by lightning. It was hands down one of the most disturbing things I'd ever seen. To watch a man, a human being, just get slaughtered by something no one had control over within milliseconds. He had a family too, and he was a good dad and husband, which just made it even worse. After the fact, I wasn't aware the effects of getting struck by lightning could vary. Many people actually survive with some degrees of burns and scars. Not him. He was completely turned inside out and unrecognizable. Even though we knew who he was, obviously they still had to identify the body via dental records. That's just how torn apart he was. Speaking of spontaneity, people also need to be more concerned with lake trips and vacations. It's not as wonderful as commercials and advertisements make them out to be. People need to remember that anything can happen at any time, on any day, and sometimes for seemingly no reason at all. It's just fate, I guess. For example, I used to work at this park with a lake as a main attraction. One day it was really peaceful out in the lake. The park wasn't packed, which was surprising. And then boom, all of a sudden, a dude drowned after falling out of his paddle boat. The death itself was already horrible, but what made it even more morbid was that he was there with a school group for their last summer vacation, along with his family too. So I experienced not only a dead body, but also ended up seeing young children coming to grips with human death for the first time. One of the friends of the deceased tried to fight with the park rangers because he thought they didn't try hard enough. To be fair, they tried the best they could, and the friend had to be dragged away by police. Another girl had told the deceased to wear a life jacket, which he didn't, and ended up blaming herself for not pressing the issue hard enough. One of the guys who ran the boat's rental heroically dove into the lake to pull up a girl who was also without a life jacket that was in the boat with the deceased when they fell, and he no doubt saved her life. When the family of the deceased finally saw the confirmation of the body, they almost immediately began wailing and howling in remorse, forming a tight circle to provide some measure of support. A crowd had gathered to watch the police fish the poor guy out of the lake, then a fight broke out because someone was smoking and another took offense. There really isn't an end to the story. They took his body out of the lake and then everyone reacted in whatever ways their brain enforced. Anger, dread, and grief, when it was supposed to be simply some kid's classroom's last day of school before their big summer break.
I come from a remote island called Rendova, located in the Solomon Islands, and have since moved overseas, hence access to the internet. Across from our island is another island called Tetepare. The story of Tetepare is really interesting, because it was abandoned completely by the inhabitants a few centuries ago. Just like the villagers fled the island to come to neighboring islands, such as my own, and here we are a few centuries later. Because of the lack of humans on the island, it is known for its biodiversity, and few researchers come every now and again to have a look. If you're looking for cool remote places to travel after the pandemic, I highly recommend it. The interesting part of Tetepare for me was, why did everyone just leave? If you were a villager back in the day, it would have been a great place to live. Volcanic soil to grow crops, an abundance of fresh water, animals that were easy to hunt. But the official story told is there was a great sick, and people were dropping like flies left and right. So the villagers fled to get away from the sick. However, the island is known for being so very big. Realistically, if you wanted to get away from others, it wouldn't have been too hard, because you could be self-sufficient on other parts of the island. The story told to me growing up is a bit different though. Back in those days, we loved to fight. A war canoe from my island, Rendova, arrived on Tetepare to fight. However, upon arrival they were met with numerous unburied dead bodies. All the large canoes that belonged to the Tetepare people were gone. To leave so hastily and not even bury your dead was a really weird thing, because it was back in the days where they first thought that spirits had done this to these people. However, the people from Rendova decided to set up villages against their better judgment. In due time, they also fled because the spirits that had decimated the population of Tetepare apparently attacked the newly set up villages there. Ever since, the island has continued to remain uninhabited, except for a few of the eco-lodges that tourists come and visit now and again. Now in present day, we go to Tetepare to maybe have a picnic or go hunting. We are, however, extremely cautious, because it is believed the island is still extremely wild, and because of the lack of humans, spirits run amok on the island. I have some weird stories about going hunting there too, and I think it's time to tell you them. The island is said to be wild because no churches have been built on it yet. For this reason, it is alleged that spirits still roam free. Ever since I was small, we went hunting on Tetepare. They have an issue with wild boars destroying their natural habitat, so hunting is encouraged, and as a result of chasing boars around the island, I have a pretty good knowledge of knowing where things are. A few years ago when I was younger, while we were hunting, we decided to go visit our other relatives at the Eco Lodge. Recommend visiting if you want a unique experience. There was a researcher who wanted to have a look at unique flora and fauna, and since I was the only one who spoke English somewhat fluently, I volunteered to take him. We explored the island quite extensively. The thing is, we know that when we're hunting we don't go deep into the rainforest, because you may not come out. Simply because of its density, but also because there have been stories of other things. Anyway, I was taking this researcher around and he had a navigational piece of equipment. He was using it to see where we were going. The day was coming to an end, and I wanted to return to the Eco Lodge because I didn't want to be camping in the middle of the night without shelter. The way we normally do things is come back out of the rainforest towards the coast, and from there, walk to wherever we need to go, because we don't want to get lost in the rainforest. I knew where we were, and I knew the way to the coast, and told the researcher, let's get going this way. This is where things get weird. His device was saying the coast was the completely different direction from where I knew the direction to the coast was. Now I've heard stories when people go hunting about losing their minds and going straight into the rainforest and never coming back out. At that point I had to question my own brain, because what his device was saying was completely different to what I knew. But I knew in that moment that it may be his device playing up, and I didn't want to take the risk of disappearing into the rainforest because of it. I had walked this forest thousands of times, so decided to trust my gut. I told the researcher I thought his device was incorrect. He did not like the sound of that at all and tried to argue with me, saying that I was wrong. I knew something was wrong, and so I didn't want to spend my time arguing and wanted to get out of their area ASAP. So I basically told him, I'm going the way I know to get to the coast. You can follow your device if you want, but I'm not following you because you're wrong. We may die. Long story short, I followed the direction I knew and lo and behold we made it to the coast. Thing is, if we'd have followed his device, we would have ended up in the densest part of the island where people are known to have gone missing. When we made it back to the Eco Lodge, he apologized and checked his device to see if it was broken. But lo and behold, turns out it was working perfectly again. This took place around 12 years ago. And after listening to so many stories, I figured I'd finally share my own. This happened to me when I was around 12, and actually had to get my brother to help recount it, as I was scared, so scared, when it happened. I was about 12, like I said, and my brother was 26 at the time. He had been serving in the US Army for several years when this happened, and was deploying to the Middle East on his second deployment if I remember correctly. Also of note is that he is a Green Beret, and had recently, 3 or 4 months prior to this trip, completed the Army's Special Forces qualification course, Robin Sage and all of that, and by then was an active duty SF engineer sergeant. Definitely not someone you'd want to mess around with. Given that we both grew up with a passion for the outdoors, he thought it would be nice to take me on a backpacking trip in northern Alabama, the Sipsey Wilderness, for those familiar with the area, before he left for 9 months. The trip had gone smoothly. Up until the third night, we were both camping out. At around 8 p.m., we had our camp set up, sitting by the fire talking about typical boy stuff, guns, girls. For some reference, our spot was about 50 yards from a large stream, and about 50 yards downhill adjacent to the large path. Our camp, the stream, and the path formed a triangle of sorts. This was summertime in Alabama, so it wasn't quite dark yet when 2 guys who looked to be in their late 20s wandered up and asked if we had seen any hogs while we were hiking around. Given that this is rural Alabama, we actually had seen some farther into the wilderness area and told them so. Even though they were relatively polite, my brother called them good old boys, I got a seriously creepy vibe from them. Dirty clothes, greasy hair, scraggly facial hair, etc. I think they probably looked like they belonged in the movie Deliverance. They kinda hung out for a few minutes, maybe a little longer than they should have, looking around, asking us questions like how long we'd been out there, how long we were staying up, and what to me appeared like them sizing us up. They then abruptly said goodbye and walked away. I didn't necessarily feel threatened by them, and I know for sure my brother didn't, but I still felt uneasy about the whole thing. Fast forward 3 or 4 hours, my brother and I had gone to sleep and were nestled in our tent when I woke to the sound of multiple dogs barking. I've always been a heavy sleeper, and they sounded like they were only 100 yards away. My heart immediately started pounding, and I kicked my brother through the sleeping bag and asked if he was awake and heard the dogs. He responded, "I'm awake. They've been getting closer for the past hour or so. Just lay still and don't make any sounds." Needless to say, 12-year-old me was about to crap my pants. We would also hear sporadic shouts from several different sources, but neither came any closer. A few minutes later, my brother whispered, "They're just hunting for hogs. They use dogs to pin them down and then later shoot them." This gave me some relief, but not much. Somehow I managed to fall back asleep. The fact that they were doing this at night was a huge red flag, my brother later told me, but I think he was just trying to keep me calm. Fast forward what was probably another 3 hours or so. It was 2 a.m. I had managed to sleep pretty well, after first hearing the hog hunters when I woke up to my brother squeezing my shoulder firmly saying, "Wake up, put your shoes on, and follow me quick. Be as quiet as you can." My heart immediately went back to racing, because I heard the dogs and voices in the distance, farther away than before, but still distinct. Not asking any questions, I did as he said, and as soon as we were out of the tent, he told me to get on his back. This was a breeze for him after rucking with God knows how much weight in the army. We snuck about 50 yards into the woods towards the junction of the path and the stream, and crawled into some bushes. It was up a hill, so we had a pretty good elevated view of our campsite. I remember as we were laying there how loudly I was breathing and how quiet he was, when I heard the very distinct sound of a pistol slide racking. I look over my shoulder. My brother had his pistol, an HK USP that he gave to me a few years after this story, and was watching the campsite and surrounding area. I started to whisper to him when he put his hand over my mouth and pointed at the campsite. The group of hunters had been steadily approaching our camp, and by this time, 30 or so minutes later, had reached it. There were 5 of them, and 3 or 4 dogs. They all looked relatively young, but 2 had either rifles or shotguns, and the dogs were going crazy, obviously having smelled our scent. For those of you who are backpackers/campers, Nobody who comes up on a random camp in the middle of the night with dogs and guns has good intentions. I knew this, and my brother knew this. I was scared out my mind. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but my brother later told me they were talking about us, although he hadn't heard any specifics either. They lingered for around 20 minutes, shining flashlights around and talking to themselves, when my brother put his mouth to my ear and said, "If they come towards, I want you to turn and run as quickly as you can. Don't stop. Don't look back. Stay off the trail and look for the flashing lights." I didn't know what this meant, but that'll come later. I knew I could make it back because he had taught me to land nav pretty well. He then handed me a flashlight and told me to not take the red filter off. He told me later that the red filter helps preserve night vision and cuts down ambient light, so it would be harder for someone to see from a distance. At this point I was so scared I almost started crying, but at the same time had a rush of adrenaline, and what I think now was confidence that he thought I could handle myself. We laid there for a while longer when out of nowhere they started screaming, "Where y'all at?" and firing into the woods at random. My brother dragged me back behind the crest of the hill and threw himself on top of me. Thankfully, our position on top of the hill was protected from any gunfire. They shot maybe 5 or 6 more times, and then they started walking back in the direction they'd come from. They got about 100 yards away when I heard a blaring siren and saw emergency flashlights through the woods. Turns out, my brother had called the Forest Service office on a satellite phone my family has for emergencies while I was asleep, and they had sent out Forest Service officers and game wardens to our area of the wilderness. The Sipsey Wilderness is about 25,000 acres in size, so it took them a while to get there on the dirt roads. When we saw the game truck, my brother signaled them with the light and pointed them in the direction the hunters had gone, and the guys sped off, shining his spotlight through the woods. As soon as they were all gone, we went back to our camp, packed up our stuff, and waited by the path for the game warden to come back, who then gave us a ride in his truck bed to the main staging area. On the drive back, my brother told me how brave I had been, and that we would talk about it with our parents the next day if I wanted to. I asked him not to do that, because I thought they would never let me camp again. Creepy rednecks in the woods? Let's not meet again, or you might get shot next time. For follow-up, we never got any definitive information on what happened to the rednecks we encountered. I have many friends who have gone out to the Sipsey area and had a great time with no creepy stuff happening. However, it is truly a wilderness area, and law enforcement response, if you can even reach them, would be slow. I was lucky that my brother was there and reacted so quickly, otherwise who knows what could have happened. We also got lucky that whatever their intentions were, they either reconsidered or lost interest. I will note that when they left our campsite, the game warden showed up pretty soon after, but I didn't see what the guys and their dogs did. If I remember correctly, they headed in a direction parallel to the stream, away from the trail, inaccessible to any kind of vehicle. Maybe the warden continued on and took another trail to try and cut them off. We waited around a half hour for him to come back, and he said there were other officers on the lookout. There are only so many paths that you could take a truck or quad bike down, so any thorough search effort would have to have been done on foot. In any case, let's never meet again.
I've lived and worked here in Portland, Maine, and every spring we get biblical levels of rain. It's a huge pain in the butt, but it's something you just learn to live with after a while. You invest in a good umbrella and a waterproof coat and just muddle on like a good Mainer does. Although if some of you Californians saw the kind of weather we endure, you'd be more than likely to call us maniacs as opposed to Mainers. As I said, for the most part, the rain is nothing but a minor irritation, a price we pay for the magnificent falls that are enjoyed by leaf peepers from all over the country. But as I found out one dark and rainy night,
The climate in this area of the country can sometimes make it straight up dangerous to live here. So picture the scene. It's raining cats and dogs. I'm walking back to the apartment in an older part of town, and it's full dark. One of the streets on my regular route has been around since the early 1800s and is still lined with cobblestones, while the sidewalks are these big, flat, slate-like slabs that can get super slippery in the spring and fall. I'm pretty sure it's because of a special kind of algae or moss that grows on them, making them really slimy, but I'm not a biologist, so don't quote me on that. All I know is it can be like a freaking ice rink at certain times of the year, but on one occasion it was more of a death trap than an ice rink. I'd already gotten an idea of how slippery it was as I was walking, but as I got a text that I assumed was from my boss, hopefully regarding the raise I've been probing for, the light from my phone must have thrown my vision off and, in turn, my footing. Because one minute I'm just walking along minding my own business, and then next, I'm lying on the sidewalk with the wind knocked out of me, as the ground beneath me just up and disappeared or something. The first thought that registers through my brain is all sorts of expletives that I can't repeat here, and as I try to find my feet again. Only I can't. My left foot just doesn't seem to do what I want it to, and when I look, it's flopping around in this way that makes my stomach churn. That's when the pain starts to throb through my leg, and in seconds, it's like my entire body is just racked with agony. Every time I move, this shooting pain just zaps up my calf and thigh, and I begin to realize I've suffered either a serious break or a very serious sprain. Any other time, I'd have just called 911 there and then, but my phone must have slipped out of my hands as I fell, and when I looked around for it, it was nowhere to be seen. I started thinking it might have slipped off the sidewalk or something, but right as I'm about to look, something else grabs my attention. A sewer drain, just off the sidewalk. One of those metal grid kinds, not a culvert, and it hits me that my phone might have actually clattered down into the sewer as I fell. It was a horrendous stroke of misfortune, but I figured it couldn't be long until a passerby stumbled across me so I could get the help I needed. But as I'm looking around, getting increasingly soaked by the relentless New England deluge, I realize there's not a soul on the streets. You get accustomed to Maine rain, that's a given, but you still avoid going out in the worst of it. It occurs to me that if I'm actually wanting any help, I might actually have to call out for it, or even scream for it. So there I was, forced to actually scream for help, and as weird and prudish as it sounds, I don't know what was worse, the pain, or the sheer embarrassment that I'd fallen and couldn't get up. I give 3 solid blasts of "Can anyone hear me? Help, I'm hurt real bad," but no one seems to respond. Like I can see lights on in windows of apartment buildings mere yards away, so I knew well people could hear me. They just chose not to help. It was pretty crushing thinking that people actually knew I was there, but didn't lift a freaking finger to help. But I guess that's life in big cities these days. People are terrible. Assume everything is fake or a scam or whatever. It is what it is. Anyways, a few minutes go by and it slowly becomes apparent that no one is coming to help, and that if I want to actually make any progress in getting to the emergency room, I might actually have to drag myself along the wet sidewalk until I find someone compassionate enough to actually help me. But just before I'm forced to undergo such an indignity, I suddenly see the silhouette of a person appear in a streetlight, and I start calling out to my shadowy potential savior. Now, you'd think if you saw a girl lying in the street calling out for help with obvious pain in her voice, you'd at least change your pace to get over to her a little faster. But this guy seems to notice me, stop for a second, and then just carried on walking over to me at the same speed, without saying a word. It was a weird feeling having that overwhelming relief turn into absolute dread in just a few moments. The person approaching me wasn't giving off any of the compassionate, helpful vibes that I expected. In fact, they were giving off quite the opposite. They didn't say a thing in response when I was all like, Sir, I think I've broken my ankle. Can you please call 911? Just stayed completely silent. Seconds later, I'm looking up at this guy, rain splashing my eyes, and with his hood up I can barely make out any of his facial features. "What happened to you?" he asks, seemingly barely concerned at all. It was also like he hadn't been paying any attention at all when I actually told him what the issue was. Like, at the risk of sounding ungrateful, I totally spelled it out for this guy, and to have him reply with, "Huh? What?" was as frustrating as it was unnerving. I tell him all over again, but skip the backstory in favor of just begging him to call 911. He barely moves, or rather, he made 0 attempts to get his cell phone out to make the call. Instead, he just towers over me, silently staring at me like I was some kind of animal curiosity. I dropped my phone. Can you see it anywhere?" I remember asking him. At that moment, he did actually start looking around for it, which momentarily restored a little of my hope that he actually wanted to help. But in hindsight, I don't think he'd have handed it over if he'd found it. Because his next move, one which I mistook for him trying to help me up, was to basically start patting me down for valuables before he just went and grabbed my purse off me. I was stunned to silence as he rifled through its contents, helping himself to a few loose bills. I couldn't believe anyone could be so callous, even in a big city like Portland. I was disappointed, angry, and in pain, but I wasn't outright scared until the guy took out my photo ID that I use for work, stared at it for a moment, and then slid it into his pocket. Because that's when I realized that he wasn't doing this just for monetary gain. He wasn't so much of a thief or an opportunist as he was an outright predator. And the thought of what he was going to do next completely terrified me. He didn't walk away with the money and my ID. He just carried on standing over me, staring, probably delighted at how helpless I was, how he could do whatever he liked to me, and there wasn't a soul around to stop him. A 38-year-old woman, and I felt like crying, like a little girl. I begged him not to hurt me, to just leave with the money he'd taken. I think he just got off on that, but what else was there to do? I was in no position to fight back. Best I could hope for was to hit him with my keys if he tried to, take things further. Then right as I'm reaching for them, lying there, discarded on the sidewalk, I hear one of the sweetest sounds I'd ever heard in my life.
"Excuse me, is everything all right?"
It was a guy's voice, polite but aggressive, accusatory. Someone had finally emerged from one of the nearby apartment buildings, and at that, the hooded guy starts walking off, just as chill as ever.
Hey, I'm talking to you."
The guy says before looking back at me, then calling back inside for, I'm guessing, his wife and someone to call the cops. He then rushes out to ask if I'm okay, which triggers the biggest wave of ugly crying as I just point to my messed up ankle in between shakes of my head. Cut to a few hours later, I'm laid up in the hospital with a broken ankle, high as a kite on the best stuff the Blue Cross can buy. I gave a statement to the cops, had a little cry with my mom when she came to visit, then went about informing all my coworkers that I wouldn't be seeing them for a few months. I got some small amount of closure when I heard the guy was arrested for petty theft. Apparently he had a history of drug addiction and mental illness, and had committed a handful of opportunistic robberies over the last few years. As a result, this last strike was going to send him back to jail for a few years. Something I take a great deal of comfort in.